So if I were to ask you, if Jesus were to come into our church right this very moment, what would you want Jesus to heal you of to make you whole? Think about that. What kind of healing might you need, or maybe you don't need? Maybe there's healing that you need for a family member, a friend. Is there healing for the community that you wish for the world? The story that we heard in the gospel today talks about a man who was in deep, deep mental, emotional trouble, and he needed healing. And people didn't know what to do with him for the longest time. And it wasn't until Jesus healed him that the people, when they saw this man was healed, they were still afraid because they couldn't believe what had happened. They couldn't believe the turnaround of this man now, totally in his right mind, calm, collected, and doing well. And the other thing that was upsetting for the man who was healed, he wanted to then continue to follow Jesus, because look what Jesus did. Jesus healed him, helped make him whole. And so this man who wanted to continue following Jesus was told no. Can you imagine Jesus telling you, no, go back home? Wouldn't you be crushed? I know I would be. But Jesus had a point. It's like he knew that this man needed to go back to his home, one, so he could be accepted again by his community, because certainly he was an outcast, he was an outsider before this, and so now he could be welcomed back into his community. And when he could tell people how he had been healed, how he had been made whole, they could then not only welcome him, but then they could understand what Jesus could do, but what faith can do if they prayed to God. And so it was a way of helping that community heal as well. I want to talk a little bit about healing and brokenness, but also I know that there's times in our lives where maybe we're going through a rough patch, and sometimes we need somebody to help us out. Sometimes it's just through prayer. But often, if you go through something, sometimes once you get through it, once you are well again, you may encounter somebody else who's going through a similar situation. And you know, usually that's when you can help somebody else, right? Because you've been through that. And I knew this one woman years ago. She had breast cancer many, many years ago, before people really knew how to treat and how to deal with it. And she had no help from anybody because nobody else knew how to handle it. And so one of the things she did was she started learning as much as she could, and then she created a support group and started connecting with others so that she could be a support to others, to help them heal, to help them deal with their brokenness of their body, etc. So there's different ways that we can do that. But let's talk a little bit about Jesus the healer. I think there's a few things that we need to recognize when we need some kind of healing. First of all, we have to be willing to confront whatever it is that we're facing. And sometimes those truths are really hard. Sometimes they're really difficult to face. Sometimes the information you get, especially if it's a physical ailment from a doctor, can just be crushing. It can just be devastating. And then when we do that, we really need to acknowledge if we have grief. We need to allow ourselves to grieve. If there's support that we need to reach out to others and ask for that support. So if we think about that kind of healing, the confronting those truths, we need to realize that there's all types of illnesses and brokenness. I mean, the basic ones we could say are physical, mental, emotional, spiritual, which can have both psychological and physical harm to us. We can do things to ourselves. And a lot of times when we're ill, it alters how we act, how we behave, how we even react to others, because we don't always know how to handle a situation. We also are looking to recognize that sometimes something will happen and it'll be a life-altering change in our lives. If you think about it, just recently there was a Miami Dolphins player he was in a car accident. In order to get him out of the car, the firefighters had to cut off his left arm. His football career is now over. That's a life-changing situation. You know, I shared with you once before about that wonderful young man who was going on a hockey scholarship, ice hockey scholarship, to a college down in Maryland, and he wanted to help. He was starting the spring semester, which really starts in the winter, and he wanted to help the place where he was living clear the snow off the roof. So he climbed up on the roof, he fell off the roof, and is paralyzed from the neck down now. So things like that can have huge impacts, not just on that person, but on the family as well. So these are difficult things that we have to deal with and understand. And there's different types of brokenness too. We have maybe that internal brokenness of our spirit and our mind. Besides the illness of our body, there's also sometimes an alienation from others and from our neighbors. We isolate ourselves because we don't want to interact with anybody else when we're in a situation. And it also can alienate us from God, just as I read part of that in the Psalm. So we have the confrontation of hard truths, that's like the first part of it, but then we want to have restoration of our wounded souls. So how do we become restored? Whether we've been broken physically or whether we've been broken in desperation or depression, whatever it may be, there's pain involved. And so we want to be healed and we want to be made whole. And yes, it can happen. Sometimes it's just through recovery, especially if you have addictions. Sometimes you're just recovered. You may not be totally cured, but you are in recovery. And then sometimes you're in remission, right? If there's different types of cancer, you may be in remission. But ultimately, if we are made whole, isn't there some joy around that once we feel better? Once we are feeling, especially if we sense all the prayers that people have been lifting us up with and what God has been doing in our lives, there's a sense of joy and maybe some peace and contentment because we know other people are reaching out to us with love and compassion, and so is God. And that can be very, very powerful. And so then once all that happens, then what do we do with that? Do we just say hallelujah, which is great? Or do we also then share our story with others, share how the people, our faith community, our friends, how God helped us become whole? Don't we want to share that with somebody else? Just like the man who had the demons in our scripture reading today. He was told to go home so he could share that story with his community. And sometimes we see some wonderful things that happen in the news. I mean, occasionally we do hear good positive things in the news. And it's always so much gratefulness when somebody has helped somebody else, right? When you see somebody either being healed or somebody being saved, like the family that trusted letting their children go out of the window from the fire, and they had to drop their children to be caught by strangers. But the gratefulness for that, those are all special things that help us in times of despair and torment, in times of brokenness. And I know it seems odd that we're talking about brokenness when it's so hot outside and we're in the summer and we just want to play with the beach ball. And yes, we can play with the beach ball. Maybe that'll make us whole today, that may help us. But I think it's important for us to recognize that through all our seasons of life, we may be going through ups and downs, and sometimes life just seems like a roller coaster. You're on a real high, and then all of a sudden, boom, it changes. And we need to, one, not only face whatever it is that we're facing, but we need to ask for help. Because we're never alone. God is always with us. So we're never alone. And here we are as a church family, as a church community, as a praying community. We have people who can lift us up. And I think that's really important. So what I want to do right now is I want to share a little story. It's from a book called The Wounded Healer by Henry Nouwen. He was a Catholic priest up in Canada. And I want you to listen to this dialogue that happens between a man and a theology student who's like a first-year theology student. who's learning how to be a hospital chaplain. And I want you to listen to the dialogue, and then I'm going to ask you some questions as to like what did you pick up, what did you not pick up, especially about the man who is now in the hospital. So Thaddeus is going to help me with this. So let me give you a little background. Mr. Harrison is a farmer. He's from the South. He's a 48-year-old farm laborer. He's stocky, tough-looking, and not used to expressing himself verbally. He comes from a very simple Baptist family, and he feels completely disoriented in the big city hospital where he was brought for an operation on his legs. So hear these words. And John is the theology student, and this is his second visit to Mr. Harrison. And Mr. Harrison is sitting in a wheelchair. So I'm going to sit down. And he's in the middle of a ward where other patients are present. Some of them are talking with each other, but here's the conversation.
Mr. Harrison, I came by to see you the other day.
Oh, yes, I remember.
Well, how are things going?
Well, I'll tell you. They were supposed to operate on me last week. They got me drugged, took me up there, and my heart flew up. They decided they better not try it then. They brought me back down here, and I'm supposed to have the operation tomorrow.
You say your heart flew up?
Yes, they thought it might be too risky to go through with it. I guess I'm ready for the operation. I think I can make it.
You feel you're ready for it?
Well, I'm not ready to die, but I think the operation is necessary or I'll lose my legs.
You're not ready for the end, but you want something to be done, if possible, so you won't lose your legs.
Yeah, if this is the end, this is one who's gonna be lost.
You feel the cause is lost if you don't make it through the operation.
Yeah, of course. They told me there's not too much to the operation. They're gonna dope me up right here and keep me here until it's time for the operation. They said they're going to put some plastic tubes inside me, and that ought to save my legs. You see my foot here? This toe here gets blue when I stand on it. They could amputate it here by the ankle, but this way they might save my legs.
Well, it's worth the operation if you can use your legs again.
Yeah, of course, I don't want to die during the operation. I'd rather die a natural death than die through anesthesia.
You know, the possibility of death is present during the operation, but the only way you can get well is to have the operation.
Yeah, that's right.
You got much more waiting for you when you leave the hospital, you know?
No, nothing and nobody, just hard work.
Just a lot of hard labor.
Yeah, that's right. Of course, I got to gain my strength back. I figure I'll be ready about the time the tobacco crop is ready.
You'll be working with a tobacco crop?
Yeah, picking starts around August.
Well, Mr. Harrison, I hope things go well for you tomorrow.
Thank you. Thanks for coming by.
I'll be seeing you. Goodbye.
Goodbye. So, there's a scenario. Did you pick up on any concerns that Mr. Harrison had at all?
He was scared.
He was scared, right? He was scared. First of all, I set the stage where he wasn't even used to going to a hospital at all. Now he's in a big city hospital, so that has totally unnerved him. What else did you notice?
He's afraid to die.
He's afraid to die, and did...
Not in the hospital anyway.
Yeah, not in the hospital, but he really didn't want to die. But he mentioned dying several times, didn't he? And I don't think John picked that up, did he? What else did you notice? Anything else?
He talked about being lost.
Excuse me?
He talked about being lost.
He talked about being lost, right? He felt that he was lost. Did he have anybody to look forward for him to come back? No. He had no support. And you know, so one of the things that happened is after this scenario happened, John went and then talked to the head chaplain, and they reviewed everything, and then John realized some of the things that he could have done better. This, first of all, this man was scared. He wasn't sure. I mean, his heart was a mess, so he was definitely scared, and they couldn't operate on him. And if he didn't get the operation, he'd never be able to work again, right? So that could be a life-altering experience. Yes.
What was the condition he had again? You said his heart flew up?
Well, his heart flew up. That was his terminology. But he had problems in his legs, circulation in his legs. And so if he didn't have the tubes put in his legs to increase the circulation, they were going to have to amputate his legs. So that was the original condition. That's what they were going to do. They were going to put tubes.
Is it a true story? How old?
He was 48. 48 years old.
Is it a true story?
I don't know. I'd have to go back and look into this as further back in the book. So we have this man who was scared, a man who felt out of place. He was very disoriented being in a hospital. He didn't have anybody to come home to. He didn't feel like he had any support, even though it was nice that John went and talked to him, right? But did he have any hope for tomorrow? He really didn't. He really didn't. And in the operation, he actually did die. So it's one of those things that we don't realize that there are times when we can make a difference with somebody else. We have to listen. We have to hear what is being said, and sometimes read between the lines, right? What's not being said. Look at this man. His body images and all that stuff, right? Look at those things and find a way. I mean, even if John said, well, I'll be here tomorrow. I can't wait to come talk to you again. I will be here for you for as long as you wish, and talk about God. I mean, that might have given him a little bit of hope. I know a lot of hospitals today, especially if they're going to have a big operation, they usually have you meet with some kind of counselor or social worker ahead of time now to help get you in the right frame of mind before you have an operation. Because let's face it, it's scary. It's really scary. So there was some different types of brokenness that this man was experiencing. And that's just something that I wanted to bring to light, is that all of us, because we follow Christ, whether we realize it or not, we are healers. And we can be healers. We are called to heal for others. Maybe some of you are doctors and nurses where you actually do help do the physical healing. Some of it may just be the companion, the person sitting there listening, talking, asking questions, being the encourager. And some of it is we're all prayer folks, right? We pray. There's different ways that we can help others heal. There's different ways, because of what Christ has done for us, that we can help people to not only heal but to become whole. And that's through the love and grace of Jesus Christ. So brokenness doesn't have to be a lifelong experience. Torment, torture, whatever you want to call it, being tormented, feeling tormented, doesn't have to be a lifelong experience. We can help be the healers that God has called us to be. Amen.